This community update was brought to you by U-Radio. A new report released by the University of Winnipeg and the Manitoba Eco-Network is calling for major changes to how Manitoba evaluates the environmental impacts of development projects. The report, titled Putting People and the Planet First, What Manitobans Expect from Impact Assessment, highlights that Manitoba's current system, governed by the Environment Act, hasn't been significantly updated since 1988.
I'm Heather Fast. I am the Policy Advocacy Director of the Manitoba Eco-Network.
My name is Patricia Fitzpatrick. I am a professor in the Department of Geography and a chair in the Masters of Development Practice Indigenous program.
So today was a very exciting day for environmentalism, climate change, looking at, putting people and the planet first. When we're looking at this study, let's just start there. Why did you want to do a project like this? I assume it takes a lot of work to do any study or project of a caliber like this.
Well, Trish and I have both been working on this topic for a combined, 30, 50. Trish much more than me. I definitely have been working specifically on reforming the Environment Act for the past 10 years. I actually was the author of the Manitoba Law Reforms Commission report in 2015, providing recommendations. So it's been a bit of a passion project throughout, but it was really thrilling to get to really focus on hearing from the public. So that was a really fun piece of this project.
I think we recognized about 3 years ago there was a lot of call to reform the Environment Act, which is where the impact assessment process lies, in op-eds and letters to the editor. And we looked at the work of the Law Reform Commission from 2015 and thought, this is a great start, but it needs to be updated. And then, as Heather said, we really wanted to hear what people on the streets of Manitoba had to say.
Yeah. So looking through this whole thing, around 500 Manitobans that you were able to connect with from across the province in, through workshops, those surveys and everything. What was the process of this engagement, and how do you work through that data and information that people are providing you to compile a report like this?
So we set out to have a multi-pronged process with creating fact sheets for the public, creating research memos, and then, yes, as you said, hearing from people through public workshops and expert workshops. And it's really boring how you compile the data. It's quite standard qualitative data analysis. We put all the information in a program, and we highlight and identify key themes. And the themes that we wrote about were themes that we heard through each and every one of our engagement initiatives. So the 8 themes that we wrote about, we heard in the survey, we heard in Brandon, in the PAW, in Winnipeg, from the experts, from people who also just wrote in and submitted comments. And so that's how we identified the themes that were the most relevant.
Yeah, one of the things that you both were mentioning was, how a lot of Manitobans are very informed on a lot of these discussions, as well, are incredibly passionate. One of the things that really stood out to me was that, 47% knew nothing about impact assessments, but had those high requirements that aren't even, within the current framework. So what were some of those things that you were hearing from Manitobans?
As we highlighted in the report, we essentially heard from Manitobans that they would like changes to essentially the entire process. But in terms of major themes, people really want to be involved. So that was one thing that I think those who weren't aware of the process were surprised to learn, and maybe I think we generated a lot of interest, particularly in advisory committees. A lot of youth are very interested in becoming a member of an advisory committee to be involved in impact assessment, which was a great learning for us. But we just really heard a lot of concerns about environmental protection and human health. And then we're able to translate that into a bit more of impact assessment language. But again, goes back to that protection of the people and the planet. And a lot of the key themes really just go back to that. Wanting to make sure that community members who are experiencing things in their day-to-day lives are able to speak about those impacts and for them to actually make it on the record for decision makers to consider.
Would you like to add anything?
Just to say that it was really exciting to hear people at a workshop in, I'm going to say April, in Brandon, give up a significant portion of their day for something that they weren't really clear about. The passion that they had for protecting people and the environment was exciting. And then my colleagues got to go to the PAW and had similar amazing stories of people talking about how to make a Western colonial process work for rights holders, and to make sure that traditional knowledge is considered and UNDRIP is respected, and think about Indigenous-led processes. It just really, it really counters the narrative that we're hearing on a daily basis in the news these days.
Let's talk about that a little bit. One of those core themes and things that was brought up several times was Indigenous voices, having Indigenous individuals there in those conversations. Why is that an important aspect of a process like this?
So I'm not the right voice to be providing like the context of what an Indigenous rights holder would think on this topic. But in terms of why that was such an important theme that came up, is because, again, I think the general public has an understanding of what reconciliation is supposed to look like. And from the rights holders that shared their experiences, there's a lot of interest in ideas on how this can be done in a better way moving forward. So that's why our recommendation was not providing specific ideas of what this should look like, but emphasizing that there are a lot of good ideas from rights holders and also from Manitobans generally about how the process should be improved to make space for traditional knowledge and also to encourage Indigenous-led impact assessment. And so what we did was highlight the voices of Manitobans, but also linked to academic best practices and literature in our academic memos. And also we have a fact sheet on Indigenous-led practices. So again, in terms of what that should look like, I think there's a lot more conversations to be had, but we were so pleased to hear from the people who were willing to share. And again, just want to highlight that there's a lot of great voices and ideas out there that we hope the government takes the time to listen to in a meaningful way.
Oh, perfect. One of the things, those kind of three main elements that were brought up that people found of concern was those, biophysical areas, human health, but most importantly, that cumulative effects of the study. And, one of the things of people asking questions today, very passionate about how those cumulative effects were not being assessed in certain projects. Why is that an area that's incredibly important to focus on when doing these assessments?
When cumulative effects started to first get discussed in impact assessment way back in the 90s, we were told that once a project was built, the environment was the new normal. So whatever impact that project had, that doesn't count. And we're starting from scratch, despite some significant impacts that may have happened in the past. Cumulative effects is really if essential in understanding what a project will change in the environment for good or for bad. And so a lot of the experts in the field, the knowledge holders, the academics, the practitioners, they'll tell you that cumulative effects is just the way we need to move forward in thinking about how many more McDonald's can we build, how many more parking lots can we build, how many more hydroelectric dams can we build before we have changes and impacts on the sturgeon on the water systems that are irreversible on the climate.
Okay. Another thing, we're talking about, I just want to confirm, you're talking about some numbers, some of these processes have not been updated since 1988. Is that correct? So what would that process of modernizing these processes look like?
So our recommendations have suggested to the government that the first step they should be taking is to have robust engagement with the public and also conversations with Indigenous rights holders in a meaningful way, which you would have to ask the communities what that would look like for them. But there are lots of tools that can be used to encourage meaningful public participation, including some online platforms that the government of Manitoba already has access to. And there's already a history of other types of in-person engagement and things like that. So our first step would be speaking with the public, identifying their concerns and interests, and then essentially needing to translate those concerns into the specific legal language that needs to go in the Act. So the government, again, doesn't have to start from scratch. There are things to build from the Law Reform Commission report and also the recommendations of regulators in the past, like the Clean Environment Commission has put specific language on the record that could be used to create a draft bill. And then ideally, once that draft legislation is created based on the input of Manitobans and Indigenous rights holders, then there would be additional consultation opportunities based on that, time for adjustment, and then ideally this bill that has had all these fantastic insights and consultation for would then be introduced into the legislative process. So it's a matter of documenting the concerns and interests of Manitobans and then translating that into an actual piece of reform legislation.
Yeah, so for that transparency and accountability, as well as, having independent enforcement and unpartisan reporting, will that take a significant amount of resources? Like, what sort of investments do we need to see within these departments to make these recommendations a reality?
It's hard to provide you an answer just because there are so many possibilities and opportunities for expansion. We definitely, I think, have heard from Manitobans that they would like to see more bodies on the ground doing enforcement and monitoring work. In terms of what that will look like internally, I think it does depend, again, on the specific changes that are made. But overall, we know it will require more resources, more expertise, and more bodies on the ground. And the specifics of what that will look like will really depend on the changes that are made to the Act. I don't know if you have any other thoughts.
I heard the question differently, so no.
Okay. I guess just, the, investments need to be made then in the departments.
Investments need to be made in the department, but if you're talking about the process of reform, what we did, and we got to hear from so many people in place, we did it on a shoestring budget. And so I'm not sure that we're talking millions and millions of dollars needing to start an engagement process, for the government to start an engagement process in the right way. I think that the first step is we are all treaty people. And so we need to speak to our treaty partners to find out what kind of processes work for them, the timing, and what's needed to get things done efficiently and effectively. So it could take years, but it could also take months if designed well and designed in partnership with rights holders.
When we're looking at the modernization of these processes, what sort of impact does that have, or interest does that have on a national level?
I think Manitoba has an opportunity to strengthen their act and become a model jurisdiction for other provinces to look to. That is actually something historically Manitoba did back in the 1980s when we had that original version of the Environment Act. It was very cutting edge and leading and was recognized as a model piece of legislation across the country. And at the time, the government did a lot of robust engagement processes. We had round tables where experts were meeting and providing insights all the time. So I do think this is a really great moment for Manitoba to step up and lead the way in terms of providing that strong protection of people and the planet at the provincial level. And again, taking the time to listen to Manitobans, because one of the biggest criticisms about what's been happening at the federal level is a lack of taking the time to meaningful hear from the public and particularly Indigenous rights holders. So again, there's an opportunity for leadership that we hope the government of Manitoba steps up for.
Yeah, you all talked about optimism today, that you have relationships with the government, that you're optimistic about some of those changes that can be made. Just last month, the Manitoba government released its new eco plan, and just looking at online and reading about it, there are some mixed reactions to it. CPAWS supports these changes, but there's also criticisms about the specific criteria involved in some of those changes. The Free Press had an article, says the plan overlooks the sale of carbon credits, as well as Professor Scott Forbes said was criticizing this, saying it doesn't go far enough. So I guess just what works with this plan, what you're seeing, and what things don't and could use some changes and some improvements.
So I believe you're talking about the path to net zero policy. I think this is why we've chosen to focus on law reform as opposed to policy reform. One of the things about the type of reform bill that we would want to see for the Environment Act and the impact assessment process is it would be required to be quite detailed. And one of the big criticisms, as you've already highlighted, of the recent plan that was the policy that was released was that it was very high level and lacked a lot of the specific details, which they have promised will come out in the action plans associated with the key themes highlighted in the pathway. We do have some comments online. The Eco-Network's perspective is that it was pretty narrowly focused, and there are a lot of other pieces that could be addressed in the overall kind of climate justice, environmental justice realm. But I do think that focusing on something like a robust impact assessment reform bill and putting those details about what Manitobans want to see about protections for the environment and public health, that can also be used as information to be brought into other conversations, like a discussion of climate policy and I think discussions potentially of reform of our, like the Climate and Green Plan Act, which would be a similar reform process down the road. So to me, all of this is very much overlapping, and the same concerns that we're hearing from Manitobans about the impact assessment process also speak to some of the challenges that have come up in the context of the pathway. So I do think that I don't have there are some colleagues in the room that would actually have some great, much more detailed pieces about the pathway, but overall our focus is really just highlighting that we want more specific details. Manitobans want more transparency and specific information about what's happening. And then again, there's a lot of interest in stronger protections, whether that's in a climate context or otherwise. It's about protecting the people and the planet, and that to me has come out in all of these conversations and something that's highlighted everywhere, including in the pathway policy.
Patricia, do you have any thoughts or comments?
So specifically about impact assessment reform, when we said that there have been calls for impact assessment reform, I've been engaged in 5 since I've moved to the province in the late 1990s. So when I say I'm cautiously optimistic, it's because there's a strong potential that this report will sit on a shelf and nobody will listen to it, and we'll need to do this again in another 5 or 10 years. But with this government, they can surprise you. So I'm thinking to Bill 23, which is the legislation which will go to third reading next week. And there were some flaws with Bill 23. And when it went to committee, the whole committee heard the public talk about those flaws and made changes, leading to a really good bill that will protect Manitobans who speak about environmental issues. And so I'm cautiously optimistic that this might be the time and the place that we can actually move impact assessment reform forward.
Okay, and then just my final question for both of you is just about public engagement about topics like this. One of the things that stood out to me when you're talking, you were mentioning, sometimes these sorts of things are referred to as red tape bureaucracy. But for what we're hearing from Manitobans, particularly in this study, is that these sorts of decisions or lack thereof impacts their lives. So, just from this survey, the engagement from people coming out today or just, throughout your life, how are you feeling in terms of how Manitobans are engaging with these questions?
I think I'm probably in a position to feel super optimistic about this because I work specifically with community members who are engaging on this topic and also teach students who are very interested. So I do think that particularly with as scary as what we're hearing in the media is, there is such an onslaught and so much more public discussion of impact assessment that the public really is gaining an understanding of its importance. And the more that we can get information, plain language information out about how it's not such a scary thing and that regular people can share their regular thoughts in plain language and it can still be considered important. Just seeing some of that and hearing from the passionate community members that we have, I think that Manitobans are interested and they're looking for more ways to engage. I go to events all the time hosted by the community, whether it's online, in person. There's things happening all the time. And so to me, my optimism continues forward, I guess. And I do see Manitobans speaking up and engaging in response to all of this increased discussion of these projects and things potentially happening in Churchill and things like that. So I think if the government did follow through and step up and have a meaningful engagement process with multiple opportunities, that there would be a lot of people that would step up and engage and share their insights on impact assessment. So I think people are engaging. Maybe they're a little scared and unsure, but I find that when we're getting good information about what's actually happening out there, they are able to say, okay, and then redirect into very powerful messaging that, again, I have seen government decision makers respond to in a very positive way. So
I agree. I think some of the language of impact assessment can be quite jargony, and so people then get turned off because you can't relate to cumulative effects as a word, but you can relate to how things change as you build more parking lots. Things are changing as you tear down more trees, and what do we need to protect the things that are important to you? I work a lot with youth, and so my biggest challenge is convincing youth that their voice matters and they will be listened to. And the University of Winnipeg has a really good tradition of listening to our students. Our students are the reason why we have a sustainability office. Our students are the reason why the university has exceeded its Kyoto commitment. Our students are the reason why we have an Indigenous course requirement. So sharing with the youth that if they go out and speak to government, people stop and listen. And they not only listen with their ears, but they hear with their hearts, and changes happen. And once people see that from the youth, I think they get more comfortable, older generations, to realize that their voice matters. So positive change begets positive change. And again, I think we have a very interesting government who's interested in listening to Manitobans, and I want to encourage them to keep doing so.